to the Ask Historians podcast.
Yes, hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm Tyler Alderson with you this week to talk about pirates. And yes, the pirates you might think of as the eye patches and the peg legs and the parrots and all that kind of stuff. But we have an actual historian of the golden age of piracy with us here to maybe disentangle some of those myths from fact, and also to discuss some really interesting pirates that is in a new book, Pirate Queens, The Life of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. So Dr. Rebecca Simon, thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
So first of all, okay, so I mentioned the eye patches and the peg legs and the parrots and all that kind of stuff. We're talking about the golden age of piracy. When we talk about pirates, I guess we should sort of give a background. What exactly are we talking about beyond just the pop culture idea of what a pirate is?
So what we're talking about are kind of organized groups of pirates that existed in the mid-1600s up until the end of the 1720s. And they're kind of three distinct eras. And the first one in the mid-1600s are mostly French pirates known as buccaneers, which comes from the French word boucanier. And they're mostly going after Spanish ships, particularly Spanish ships that have kind of kicked them out of their own havens, such as Tortuga. But what's interesting is that they're called buccaneers because they were mostly known for kind of roasting meat on land. And sometimes names just are that arbitrary. So, but that was kind of that time period. And all of this is happening during the Anglo-Spanish War, which is happening in the Caribbean between England and Spain, which means the political powers are quite distracted. So it's easy for pirates to kind of do their thing without many consequences. And the Spanish are distracted but weakened because of the war. So the French see an opportunity to do a lot of fighting. And then we have a period of piracy in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean in the 1690s, and they're British pirates as the East India Company is growing, and the British are working a lot with very wealthy Indian Mughal ships. And these include pirates such as Henry Avery and Captain Kidd. Then at the turn of the 18th century, piracy goes on pause because we have the outbreak of the War of Spanish Succession, and they require a lot of privateers, which are legally sanctioned pirates. They're given a contract called a letter of marque. And this basically, pirates are working for the government to rob and destroy enemy ships, and they're paid in what they can steal. But then after the war ends, the contracts are ended and they're all out of work. And this is the era after 1713 until the end of the 1720s when we see the most notorious pirates. We see Benjamin Hornigold, Edward Teach, or also known as Blackbeard, Charles Vane, Jack Rackham, Bartholomew Roberts, all these pirates, and many of them are veterans are veterans from the War of Spanish Succession. So they all kind of know each other or they know of each other, and there's kind of like a lot of connections here. And that's the period we're usually thinking about because it was the most active period of piracy.
And it's amazing to think that it's so short. I mean, for the hold that pirates have on the imagination, we're not talking about a long period of time at all, really.
No, not at all. It's actually quite short.
Now, why is it, you've talked about sort of the reason it started. Why is it that it actually comes to an end after such a short period of time? Are they all just captured and killed and do end up doing other things, or what happens to all of them?
Yeah, you're actually on the right track. Basically what happens is by the end of the 1720s, most of like the major pirate leaders have been killed or have died in other circumstances, such as Benjamin Hornigold, Bartholomew Roberts has been killed in a battle, Blackbeard was killed in a battle. And there are some historians who believe that the Golden Age piracy ends in 1726 because that's when a pirate named William Fly is executed. And this is the last major public execution we see of pirates. And part of the reason why piracy has also been declining is because they're starting to be, shipping lanes are massively increasing. And while you think that means piracy would increase, it actually makes it more difficult because they're being more heavily patrolled. And British American colonies, which had a lot of relationships with pirates and traded with them for quite a long time, they actually began persecuting pirates because by the turn of the 18th century, they weren't allowed to work with pirates anymore. And so now the Americas are also persecuting pirates much more than they ever had. Not only that, we have governors such as Woodes Rogers, governor of the Bahamas, who has basically made it his career to eradicate piracy. Because at this point, pirates, their haven is in Nassau, which is on the island of Providence, part of the Bahamas, off the coast of Florida. And he's become the governor, and he's made it his life's mission to get rid of pirates. And he actually does a pretty good job at it. So by 1730-ish, it's just no longer really feasible for pirates to kind of keep doing what they're doing. A lot have just kind of stopped pirating. A lot of people have escaped it. And then another war comes to break out, the War of Austrian Succession and the War of Jenkins' Ear. And a lot of those pirates are offered pardons if they agree to work as privateers again. And pirates took it because it's steady work, and the risk just wasn't worth it anymore.
So this is, I mean, I feel like, anyone who's listening who's more familiar with the pop culture references, this is a lot less glamorous and a lot more difficult and risky than maybe is made out. And one of the things that I do think is interesting is that one of the, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, one of the things most closely associated with pirates are essentially the things like peg legs and hooks on the hand that are kind of passed off as a cutesy thing. I mean, that's if you're going as a pirate for Halloween or whatever, you get I had a little hook on my hand at one point, for that, but like that's because people lost their hands and lost their legs, and I mean it was a dangerous business there. First of all, were those actually particularly all that common, and B, what was it like to actually be a pirate out there, and how much of your life on the line was there in the course of piracy?
Well, piracy was a very dangerous business. Being at sea in general was very dangerous. There's so many hazards, so many accidents that could happen. Infection is rampant because of lack of medical care and supplies. And it's no different on a pirate ship. So kind of what we see in the imagery of pop culture, like you're saying, the peg legs and the eye patches and the hooks on the hand, that is based in reality, in that many pirates did become disabled due to injury and having to have amputations. Some might lose an eye, so they'd wear a patch. Some might lose a leg, some might lose a hand, and they would get very heavily compensated for it. Pirates generally got paid anywhere between 400 and 600 pounds, sometimes even 800 if they lost a right arm or a right leg. And the money they got kind of was based on which organ that they lost. Now, the peg legs and eye patches and hooks that we see, a lot of that is actually coming from Treasure Island, Robert Louis Stevenson's novel, because of his character, Long John Silver, who wears an eye patch and has a peg leg. This is actually based on a couple of things. One is Robert Louis Stevenson had done a tour of the US and met a lot of Civil War veterans, and many of them had, lost limbs and eyes and that sort of stuff. He also had, I believe, an uncle who had a peg leg, and kind of based a lot of that imagery onto Long John Silver. And then the hook comes from, of course, J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, who kind of, piggybacked off of Treasure Island. So that is where we kind of get the pop culture-y stuff. So when we're thinking about it, we're mostly thinking about it from Treasure Island. I don't know exactly what they used in the golden age of piracy, because I've never seen any documents describing replacements for a lost limb or anything like that. I've never even seen eye patches show up in any documentation, but they would have had to do some sort of modification in order to be able to work with this disability.
And that starts getting into sort of the next question that I had. You touched on that there, where, okay, so we have this dangerous, and we should say criminal activity, a lot of death and dismemberment and execution and all that. Why is it that out of all those things, we're dressing up little 5-year-old kids, at Halloween, and I mean, everyone wants to be a pirate. There's rides at Disneyland with pirates. I mean, this was a nasty, nasty business, and yet it's also one of the most popular historical concepts.
Yeah, like people can't see me right now, but I'm nodding my head so hard. So there's a few reasons for this. And I mean, honestly, when we start getting into pop culture, my answer starts becoming the same. It's Treasure Island. Treasure Island did it because this was an adventure novel published in 1883. And Robert Louis Stevenson did a lot of research for it. He had read the book, A General History of the Pirates by Captain Charles Johnson, published in 1724. So kind of towards the tail end of the golden age of piracy. It's a collection of a whole bunch of pirate biographies. A lot of it is very heavily fictionalized and kind of meant to read like a novel. And he took a lot of this sort of facts and then kind of created an adventure story. And this story was just a smash hit in England. And then when it was published in America, it was a smash hit in England, particularly amongst boys. Part of the reason being is that the protagonist is like an 11 or 12-year-old boy named Jim Hawkins. And so over time, people are kind of really get invested in this adventure story, and they start to kind of, instead of seeing Long John Silver as like the ultimate villain, he's the villain, but he's a villain people like. Kind of like, you know, in the Avengers, for instance, a lot of people liked Loki. He was a villain, but a lot of people liked him, being charismatic and that sort of thing. It's very similar to Long John Silver. And so over time, despite the fact that pirates are seen as bad, they're kind of like the villains people began really enjoying. And this is where it kind of started to devolve into, you know, let's celebrate them. Let's have rides. Let's make fun movies. Let's make kids' costumes and that sort of thing.
I'll say that, I mean, I read Treasure Island as a kid and enjoyed it. I will say that before I actually read Treasure Island, I watched one of the great works of cinema, which is Muppet Treasure Island.
Oh, I love that one. It's so good.
Anyone who needs what I'm sure is a very, very accurate portrayal of piracy should watch Muppet Treasure Island. That's a very strong recommendation, I can say, at least from 8-year-old me.
Oh, it's just so fun. I mean, Tim Curry is Long John Silver. How do you get anything better than that?
Yeah. It's a great movie, and it kind of gets into a point that I don't know exactly how to ask this, but you're somebody who is you know, working with the very real history, and there's this I mean, you know, this movie that was like a childhood favorite of mine as a kid. When you're talking about this stuff, how do you engage people without coming across as, I guess, a bit of a bummer, to put it plainly? I mean, you know, this is something that we're constantly, you know, come across even on Ask Historians. People have this romanticized view of something, and it's like, well, yeah, okay, but then, you know, XYZ, and this, you know, this is kind of how things were. How do you work around that? Maybe still trying to engage with that romance without getting letting the romance get ahead of you or you know, get the better of you.
Well, for one thing, I'm really good at conveying information in an interesting way to like anybody. I used to be excuse me. I used to be a high school and middle school teacher, and I was a tour guide when I was in grad school. So I know how to convey information. But the big thing is, what I find is, you know, people will ask me like, oh my God, is buried treasure real? Oh my God, the peg legs, this, and this. And when I tell them, actually, no, buried treasure is a myth, and so is a lot of this, people, I don't get condescending about it. I just state the fact. And if anything, people are like, wait, what? Tell me more. It just seems to kind of, people just immediately go, wait, then what is the truth? Why do we think this? And it just seems to kind of naturally spark a lot of people's curiosity. You know, when we believe something for a very long time, and then we hear that, oh no, that's actually incorrect, our mind is blown, and our reaction is usually like, wait, what? How? What's the truth then? Like, why do we think this? And so it's just kind of the natural reaction I always get. And I have fun engaging with it. And again, I'm not being condescending about it. I've been researching piracy for a dozen years. You know, like, I know people aren't going to know what I know. People haven't researched what I've researched. Before I started studying piracy, all I knew was pop culture. So I went into my studies also thinking buried treasure and everything like that was a possibility. So I can understand where the belief come from. And I also have my experience myself, the big, what? How, what's the truth?
And that also gets into a kind of a question of, why is it that you find, you know, first of all, why is it that you find it so interesting, you know, even after you're kind of, you know, learning the truth? And why is it that, I guess, you know, you're so passionate about bringing it to other people? What is it that you think is important for people to know about?
So I've always really loved the intersection between history and popular culture. I think the vast majority of people absorb history through some sort of popular media, be it podcasts, especially nowadays, documentaries, History Channel, films, books, that sort of stuff. And so I've always found it really interesting to see how the actual history has been translated and manipulated to entertain a public. And pirates is like a phenomenal case study. But I hadn't actually ever thought about pirates as even a field to study until I was doing my master's, and I was studying something called Atlantic history, which is like the Atlantic world, the Americas, Caribbean, Africa, England, parts of Europe in the 1600 to 1800, about colonization, the slave trade. And one of the books that we read was called Villains of All Nations by Marcus Rediker. And it's about piracy and in the golden age of piracy. And in the book, he's talking about how there's a huge kind of war on piracy with the Brits trying to get rid of all the pirates. And they considered pirates to be terrorists. So they did like terrorist actions against the piracy. And I was just like, how did we go from that then to Jack Sparrow? And I really wanted to start exploring it because it really fed into my love of like examining history and pop culture and those changes. And I've always loved engaging with people. I always love that, people generally, I find usually after high school start getting interested in history. And I knew if I was going to be going into grad school and studying something very deeply in history, I also wanted it to be a topic that could get interest, that I could communicate widely and effectively. And I also just genuinely love the subject. It's fun, it's unique, it's a challenge because pirates didn't leave their own records. So everything I have to research is kind of on the periphery, and I have to start kind of like reading between so many lines and context and everything like that. So it's just fascinating to me in every way, basically.
And part of that research involves into a sort of a couple of pirates that I think I would say that they're untold history, but I do think that a lot of people have heard at least the names and the basic concepts more recently. You have a new book, Pirate Queens: The Lives of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and this is something that has come up a few times. I've been up in Mayo and in Ireland. They have a lot of things about Grania Whale there, and can you just explain first of all who they were and also why they've also kind of captivated imaginations as of recently?
Absolutely. So Anne Bonny and Mary Read were two female pirates who sailed between August and October of 1720, only 2 months. And they managed to become some of the most infamous pirates ever. The big thing is being two women who fought alongside the men, reportedly just as terrifyingly as the men. And this goes against every societal expectation and belief in everything about women of the time. Women are expected to be at home or maybe in domestic servitude. That's where they should have been, according to that century. But instead, they're pirates in a very masculine world, in a world where they generally were not allowed. So the big mystery about them is, how did they become pirates? Anne Bonny was married to the captain, Jack Rackham. But Mary Read, we don't actually know how she came to be a pirate. There has been a lot of different theories and ideas that eventually sort of kind of devolved into a lot of mythology that people now take as fact. And so with this book, what I was trying to do is I was trying to break down the historical fictionalized narrative into facts. And when I started researching this book, my knowledge of Anne Bonny and Mary Read actually was kind of the mythologized story, which is that Mary Read was disguised as a man and Anne Bonny fell in love with her, and the two of them ended up having a lesbian relationship and everything like this. And that's what I thought. I even wrote an online article kind of with that angle. But as I was researching the book, it turned out to be a much more interesting story. But also, just there were so many myths about them that just end up not being true, which I think actually genuinely disappoints people. For one thing, in my research, I learned that Mary Read was not disguised as a man because the governor of the Bahamas, Woodes Rogers, issued a warrant for the arrest of Jack Rackham and, quote, the female pirates Mary Read and Anne Bonny, which means that they knew she was a woman on the ship when they sailed out. And there's the trial, which has information about them. Mary Read was married to another member of the crew, but we don't know which one. Both women were pregnant on the ship, both women were pregnant when they were on trial. and which means they were visibly pregnant, which means they were pregnant before they became pirates. So, forget where I was actually going with this now. I can just keep going on and on and on. But they've become really, really famous because over time, the stories become so mythologized. And a lot of this is because of the book, A General History of the Pirates, which I mentioned earlier. Their stories are in the section of his book where they're pretty much all entirely fiction. And this is where we get the idea that like they were both raised as boys and that they might have had a close relationship. What's interesting is that there's never a lesbian relationship mentioned in that book. It's entirely just that Anne Bonny thinks Mary Read is a man and is disappointed when it turns out Mary Read's not. And Mary Read marries a member of the crew. The idea that the two of them may have been lesbians actually comes from a 1970s article, a feminist article called, I think it was called Anne Bonny, Mary Read, They Killed Pricks. And that's the one where it kind of comes the story of them having a lesbian relationship. And this is really taken off into what people believe is fact. But they were very real. Anne Bonny was from Ireland, County Cork and Kinsale. And so that, and then she moved to the Carolinas. Her father was a lawyer. There is a birth record for her that I found. Mary Read is actually quite a mystery. I've only found 2 documents that might be related to her. One is that her mother may have been married to a pirate because she was petitioning to try to get his goods because for the sake of her children, one of which was listed as Mary Read. And then there was a petition of 40-something women in Jamaica in 1707 whose husbands had all been arrested for piracy, and they're appealing to Queen Anne for their release, and one of the signatures is Mary Read. So it's very possible she had already been living in the Caribbean for some time and had these pirate connections, but it's impossible to verify. And this is one of the things, like all these mysteries.
Right. And all these mysteries, and especially all these mysteries that are kind of cloaked. So you have the stuff that you don't know, but you also have to deal with stuff that you, quote, do know in the sense that someone has written it, but that you can't necessarily trust. And how do you, I mean, you know, when you're going through even sources at the time or shortly thereafter, how do you pick apart, okay, you know, whoever wrote this is mythologizing here versus, no, this seems to be a fairly accurate account.
I have to read everything. I have to read like every single primary source that could be related to them in some way and see which areas say the same thing. Because if the same idea is popping up in all these different documents, if you boil it down, it's probably true, or at least based on fact. And then what I also had to do was do loads of secondary research. I had to do tons of secondary research, one about piracy and also just about the lives of women during the time period and their relationship to the maritime world. Because if those writings, if those studies applied to women in general, that means they also applied to Anne Bonny and Mary Read. So because Anne Bonny and Mary Read have so few sources about them, they're so little documented. It's just the trial. It's that one proclamation, the warrant for the arrest by Woodes Rogers, and like 2 newspaper articles that I found. So as a result, my book, when I'm talking about their childhood, I am basing it off of the fictionalized version from A General History of the Pirates. But what I'm trying to do is I'm adding in a lot of historical context, such as if Mary Read, for instance, according to Captain Charles Johnson, Mary Read was disguised as a boy, then disguised herself as a man and joined the British Army. So what I write is, if this was true, this is what her life would have been like had she really been a woman in the army. And I use also examples of other documented women who were in armies in that time period. So as a result, it's a lot of speculation, which I make very clear in the introduction. I'm like, there's going to be speculative terminology, and that's because of the lack of information, not because I'm making stuff up. So I'm having to get a lot of the wider historical context. So this book was a challenge, but a good challenge.
And it's interesting too, because I mean, you know, we're talking about sort of pop culture and all that. In some ways, it sounds like you're not just looking into the you know, the person themselves, or at least the person themselves is not the only thing that is important. The myth itself is actually important in some way. It's not that we can just discard that and say, well, that's not true, so that's it. There, you know, there are reasons why these particular myths and these particular concepts have endured and, you know, popped up and endured over time.
Right, yeah, and they keep popping up because the interest is just kind of always there. It's always growing, and people just keep building on it more and more and more. And everything comes in and out of fashion. So Anne Bonny and Mary Read have kind of really come back into popularity because of one, the show Black Sails, where Anne Bonny does feature as a main character. Mary Read is absent from the show, but Anne Bonny's there. And then also there was kind of this controversial statue that was built in England in about 2019 of Anne Bonny and Mary Read that was going to be placed in London and then in Cornwall. And a lot of people actually it was controversial because people were like, they were never in Cornwall. They were never even in London. Why are they here? And they were very much depicted as these two lesbian pirates, and that was the narrative. And so it's kind of come back a lot into the lexicon. So it's all very kind of cyclical. And because of this, it's kind of like a rumor, the more you repeat it, the larger it grows. And it's the same thing in history when it kind of devolves into pop culture and mythology.
Now, that also, their story also gets into something that's I think very popular right now in some parts of history, historical circles, and very unpopular in some parts of the kind of pop culture circles as well, which is that we have this idea of pretty much anything that happened prior to the 20th century as being sort of white men, in Europe.
Right.
And so, the pirate crews are just, we think of, oh, okay, there's a bunch of white guys on there. And it's, and there's been a kind of a chiseling away of that. And so their story is often seen, as you say, not just through a female lens, but also through a LGBT lens,
Right.
or that kind of thing. And I was wondering how you've, when you're looking at the golden age of piracy, undoubtedly there were a lot of white men, who were there. But how has the view of that changed? And, are we seeing a more, say, diverse or, a complete picture once we start looking for it, than we did before?
Yes, we are, especially in pop culture, and it's brilliant. I think the first great example, and I still think it's one of the greatest examples of a diverse pirate crew, is the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. Because on Jack Sparrow's ship, we've got white people. Zoe Saldana is a woman, not only a woman, but a woman of color as a member of the ship. And we have different men of color and people from kind of all stations and experiences. And of course, Elizabeth Swann becomes a pirate. So that's very diverse. And we see it also in the show Black Sails. We see, again, a very diverse ship in many ways. We start seeing queer relationships. And then, of course, right now, the show Our Flag Means Death. I really like how diverse the ships are. I also like the fact that there is a woman who's disguised as a man, played by a non-binary actor. I know, but she's disguised. This person is disguised. They have disguised themselves as a male on the ship, and I think that's really fascinating. In terms of that being based on reality, I think it is playing truer to the reality than we think. About the vast majority of pirates now, they were white. They were white British, white American, white European, but we also did have Black pirates. We had some Asian pirates. And we even have very few, but we do have indigenous pirates as well. The only issue is how many were there and how well were they treated? That we don't know. There were some pirates. Blackbeard was known to steal a slave ship, which he named the Queen Anne's Revenge. And allegedly he absorbed all the enslaved people into his crew. Many of them became very valued members, but then many of them were eventually sold. So we aren't quite sure exactly how utopian a pirate ship was, but they were a lot more diverse than we think. In terms of LGBT pirates, that is even more complicated. Now, there was a system called matelotage. And what this was, it was a legal agreement between two pirates where they basically are having a civil union. And the point is that way they could be legally joined. So that way, if one of them died, someone would inherit their goods, ideally, so the goods could go back to that pirate's family. Whether or not they were done romantically, it's possible. That's always a possibility. People ask me all the time, how many gay pirates were there? And I think a lot of people have this idea that pirate ships were these transgressive kind of utopian places, and therefore, like, the vast majority of pirates were gay. That's not the case. My answer is usually probably the same percentage as your place of work. But we're not going to know. And part of the reason is because the concept of homosexuality did not exist during this time. That wasn't really a concept till the 19th century. In the 17th and 18th centuries, same-sexual relationships were referred to just simply as deviant behaviors, and in some cases, very illegal. So we also have to kind of take that into consideration. And so we're not going to quite know because it wasn't recorded. So on terms of pirate ships, there is also very much the argument that there was situational homosexuality. And this is a case where you have, men living in close quarters, very isolated for long periods of time. They'll start developing these close relationships that could eventually become romantic or at least sexual. So when people ask me, a lot of people, especially right now, because our flag means death, which shows loads of queer relationships, which I love. But I think my main issue with it was that it portrayed a romantic relationship between Stede Bonnet and Blackbeard, when in history, the two of them hated each other. And Blackbeard's actually the one who betrayed Bonnet to the authorities. And they didn't even sail in the same ship, like ever. Stede Bonnet sailed on his own ship alongside Blackbeard. But now people keep saying like, oh, they were all gay. He was gay. It has to be true. And I'm like, no, it's more nuanced than that. This is one of the times where people are unhappy when I start talking about this. And it's not like I'm trying to do queer erasure. People have to understand this is not queer erasure on my part. This is just kind of looking at, there is a lack of documentation. Were there gay pirates? Yes, of course, because there have always been gay people throughout human history and in every species of everything on the entire planet. Were the majority of pirates gay? No, probably not. But they definitely were there, but we just don't know how many, and we never will. It's a long answer, I know. Thank you.
Yeah, no, but it kind of gets to, there've been a lot of things recently about, historical accuracy. And I mean, I'm thinking of things like, the people have been talking about Game of Thrones or about, Lord of the Rings. Oh, it's not historically accurate to be, diverse. And of course, these are things with like dragons and, elves and stuff like that. So they're not, they're not historically accurate anyway.
Yeah.
But in terms of, does it get frustrating to watch a lot of pop culture, in general, when oh, this thing or that thing, whether it's Stede Bonnet and Blackbeard, having a relationship, or something completely different, and how I guess, how accurate sort of, or what does accuracy mean to you in a pop culture depiction, which is obviously going to be fictional, which is, if you have a something like Our Flag Means Death, to say that, well, okay, we're going to depict it in a particular way. It doesn't seem any more or less accurate than, say, the way Pirates of the Caribbean is more or less accurate. It might just be in different, accurate and inaccurate in different ways. So I don't know how you come across that balance in pop cultural depictions.
I think for me, the real thing that I always look for is authenticity. I know that in historical fiction and everything like that, it's never going to be completely fact, because frankly, it'll be boring if it was completely fact. No, seriously, like a lot of times history, not always, but a lot of times history is actually a lot more simple than we think. And this is where artistic liberty should be taken into account. But for me, it's the authenticity. Now, despite what I've said about Our Flag Means Death, I do enjoy the show. And I thought it did a great way of representing people who just don't get represented enough. Because you mentioned, for instance, Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones getting this criticism for having a more diverse audience, aka more people of color. And people are like, this is based on Europe, and that's not true. It actually is true. There were loads of people in color throughout Europe, through all time periods, because Europe has always had massive trade connections. People are always moving around. And so people of color have always existed, but many of them weren't necessarily in high society, so we don't really see portraits of them very often, but they do show up in portraits, some of them. There's a really good book by Miranda Kaufman called Black Tudors, which shows that Black people were prominent in the Tudor court. I love the television show The Great on Hulu about Catherine the Great. Is it meant to be historically accurate? No, but what's great is the representation of people in color. of people of color that existed at court, because Russia is so diverse. So I love that. I think the only time I ever get a bit prickly about it is when people take two very real characters, and this is in anything, and completely make up their story, because people will take that as fact when they find out, oh, they were real, so this is what their story is. And I'm like, no, because that's when I feel like it's being a disservice to some of the real characters. So the show I love that I recommend to everybody is Black Sails. I have not seen a better, that is the best representation of piracy I've ever seen. And the show does feature real pirates as characters. And yes, they do change facts about the characters, but the authenticity is very much there. Jack Rackham, the actor who played him, Toby Schmitz, I thought was brilliant. He seemed to really understand who Rackham was, not the best pirate, but a great strategist. And that was done very, very well in the show. You have Blackbeard. Of course, he wasn't that accurate. He wasn't even there at the right time period, but they really portrayed his character very accurately and very well. And so that's what I like, is authenticity. Trying to keep the facts not necessarily there, but kind of sort of in like along the vein, like kind of honoring who the person is while still taking liberties, rather than just completely making up for the sake of entertainment. That's probably where my issue comes in. Like, yeah, if that makes sense.
That makes, yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and it means it also means that you have kind of an interesting role, and I'd love for you to sort of talk a little bit more about how you've found, yourself and your career and all that as somebody who is, a public facing historian in a very pop culture heavy field, and how you've I guess how you came to this particular way of doing history as opposed to the, I guess, more quote conventional way.
Yeah.
Why is it that you've decided to I guess lean into popular culture and lean into the popular nature of pirates rather than sort of sequester yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I was always a little bit of an unconventional grad student for that reason, because a lot of us, when we go into doing a master's and a PhD, the goal is to become an academic, get that tenure track job, which is almost impossible to do these days. So we have to kind of think of other things to do. But my passion really always did lie in communicating history to the public in as an accessible way as possible. I don't believe in the ivory tower. I think keeping history for other academics is doing a disservice, because a lot of the writing gets very inaccessible because it's done in a lot of academic pedagogical jargon, like I just did right now, lots of kind of subject buzzwords, as we might put it. And I've just never been interested in that. I've always loved historical fiction since I was a kid. It was always one of my favorite things, but history was also my favorite subject. So I always loved reading a book, reading a novel about something, getting interested, and then I'd read like the nonfiction version, basically, to kind of learn what was real. So the way I kind of started getting involved in doing it is I knew piracy would have an interest, and I did want to bring history to the public. And what's unusual is that my PhD supervisor really encouraged it. He was like, you can do a lot here outside academia because people will be interested in this subject. So I actually began doing just a lot of stuff on social media, on Twitter. It was social media that kind of really got it. I was pretty active on Twitter. There's loads of other academics, there's loads of other historians, both academic and public historians, so non-academic historians. And I just engaged with a lot of people, and I networked a bit. There was a meetup for a lot of public historians in London because I did grad school. I was in grad school in London, and I went, mostly public historians, because I was invited, and I made a lot of contacts, including with one of the editors at the magazine History Today. And that's where I published like my first articles. As I pitched a couple of articles about pirates, and they said, yes, great, write articles. So I did that. And I'd taken a random job when I first started my PhD doing historical research for a small film company in London. Basically, I just printed and filed for several weeks, but it was fun. And then the producer recommended me to a BBC producer who's doing a documentary about criminals in British history, and they were looking for someone who could talk about pirates, and he recommended me. So that was a random contact I had made. But the big thing I did is I created a free website on WordPress, and I blogged kind of reviewing Black Sails as it was first coming on. And then people started asking me to do guest blogs like, oh, I found this and I saw you wrote this. Can you write this for me? So I did a lot of free work for years. And then when I moved back home to LA, I began to be asked to go on podcasts, because the more I was working, the more people began to find my stuff. So it was me just staying very, very active. And over time, as I was publishing more work, my reputation began to grow, and I started getting commissioned to write more articles. I started getting paid and starting to be asked to go on documentaries and really high profile podcasts, all kinds of podcasts. I love going on podcasts and guest lectures and all this sort of stuff. And the pandemic actually has really helped, because everything went online, which meant I could start doing a lot of stuff online that I couldn't do before, more presentations and everything like that. So a lot of it was self-promotion. But then gradually the work has started coming to me until I was able to transition to part-time teaching and full-time consulting and writing, which was a long-term goal that I had. And so this is kind of how I've managed to kind of start eking out a living in that way. And so social media was a huge help. And also, oddly enough, a big thing was that one of my best friend works in marketing, and she urged me for ages, join TikTok and just do pirate facts. And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't need to. It's just teenagers. She's like, no, there are actually loads of professionals on there who communicate stuff. She's like, and I said, no, I'm doing well on Twitter. And she said, no, join TikTok. So I did about a little over a year ago. I ended up having one video go viral, and now I've got over 100,000 followers of people who and I get lots of engagement doing piracy. And I've been on podcasts. I taught an online course because people have found me. I was recently interviewed for a documentary because they found me on there. So, it's just different ways to engage with the public, really. Some of it was happy accident and based on people who I know, because I did random things. But then a lot was just kind of me just promoting myself and then just saying yes to everything until I started getting paid work.
That's my wife will be very happy to hear that TikTok has been very useful for you, because she's very much into TikTok. Always sending me videos and all that kind of stuff. So yeah,
it's addicting. The algorithm also knows you a little too well.
Yeah,
I save it for the evening.
But when you're doing all this kind of stuff, I assume that there's like a frequently asked question that you get. That there are certain things. I mean, is there anything in particular, or any particular concept that people seem to just be very interested in?
Well, generally, when people ask me questions, a lot of it are the basic background questions, such as what's the golden age of piracy? Who were the most infamous pirates? Who do you think was the scariest pirate? I get a lot of, was there buried treasure? And then my answer is no. So a lot of the podcasts I do about pirates are kind of general information, which is great. It's another way to communicate. But then when I have the opportunity to discuss something more niche, I get really excited, because then I can go deeper in other bits of information, such as here you're asking me lots about like pop culture and everything like that. I actually don't really go into depth about it very often. So that's fun. On one podcast, I talked about piracy in the American Revolution, because I actually did research some of that for my doctorate. And I was like, I never get to do something with that. So that's fun. And recently I was asked to write an article about public executions, because my doctorate was actually about public executions of pirates. And public executions itself, I actually don't get to talk about very much. So I was excited to write the article, and I'm going to be involved in a documentary about it as well. So that's something different I get to do. But for the most part, it's just the most questions people just want to know, like all like kind of the general info about Golden Age pirates, because, which is great, because that's how we get started on learning about something. And I love being able to provide like the correct information in as engaging a way as possible, and, recommending other people's work and everything like that. So, yeah.
Now we've talked about some of the good things. I do have to ask you, I mean, you're all over the web. People find that can be kind of a double-edged sword, women and people of color specifically, but really anyone who puts themselves out there like that. Mm-hmm. And especially as well, anyone who is, bursting bubbles
Yeah.
or back against pop culture, mythology, or received wisdom and all that. So have you experienced a lot of blowback on that regard?
Yes. Not as much as I actually thought I would, but I have received blowback. A lot of it has to do with the buried treasure thing. When I say that no, pirates did not bury treasure, and people will always come back. And I'm sure some people listening to this are probably thinking, Captain Kidd buried treasure, who was a pirate executed in 1701 after robbing a very large Mughal ship. And he claimed to have buried all the goods off the coast of New York, but nothing was ever found. The reality is, pirates didn't bury treasure because A, they wouldn't have had the time to go back to it, and B, they actually weren't really going after coins and jewels and that sort of stuff. They were going after valuables they could sell. 50% of everything they stole was to replenish their ship. The other 50%, stuff they could sell. And it was the same case for Captain Kidd. And there are a few documents that come later that say, oh, he did, but they're fiction. They're not real. People have come at me for that. I've gotten lots of emails about it. There was someone on TikTok. I think I did one video saying buried treasure wasn't real, and that went viral, very viral on TikTok. And there was someone there who kept commenting over and over and over about how I'm not a real historian and how incorrect I am. And not only on that one video, he began commenting the same thing on like every video I was doing, which was irritating. So that was one thing. I get unsolicited emails sometimes, not as often. Sometimes I'll get an email, someone saying, oh, I just want to let you know you're wrong about this and blah, blah, blah. 99.99% of the time, I'm not wrong. I make sure I'm not giving wrong information when I talk about things. But the biggest thing that bothered me the most was, so it was after the statues of Anne Bonny and Mary Read were released and, this controversy, and the BBC interviewed me wanting to ask my expertise, and they kept asking me about the lesbian relationship. And I kept saying there wasn't a lesbian relationship. And they kept really doing the thing where they're reframing the question to try to get me to change my answer.
Yeah.
I wouldn't.
You know what they want you to say.
Yeah, and I won't do it. And so finally they said, is there the possibility? And I said, there's always a possibility, but the reality is not likely. Well, they published the article saying they most definitely probably were. And I was really upset because it sounds kind of minimal, but it still irritated me. There's several Facebook groups about pirates that I am members of. They're a good way to get my stuff out there. A lot of people do post resources. And there was one where they posted the article, and a lot of the people in the group, and I hate to say it, but mostly men, pulled out that quote and ripped me apart in the comments. And there were a lot of comments saying, she's not a historian. Who the hell does she think she is? This is completely wrong. There's no such thing as gay pirates. And then one person, which really irked me, said, oh, she's only published one book and it wasn't even an academic one. So she's nothing here. She doesn't know anything. Now, I got really upset about this, and I didn't find out about it until like the next day because I don't go on Facebook all the time. But luckily, the moderator of the group, who knows who I am, said, you guys, Rebecca's a member. Let her speak for herself. And I was like, look, I was misquoted here. But there's always possibility that they were gay pirates, but just know I was misquoted, and, blah, blah. The moderator was like, thank you, Rebecca. And a few people commented like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Or a few people were like, that's what I figured, you were misquoted. But I really got kind of pissy about that. And there was one person who is a pirate enthusiast. I won't say any names. Meaning he's written some books about pirates, but he's not a historian, but he's done loads of research. He pulled me the part the most. His name was mentioned in a podcast and it was mispronounced, and I felt vindicated because he ripped me apart the most. Those have been the biggest things.
There's a certain real kind of petty, just sort of triumphant feel when something like that happens. But stuff like that always irks me, because then suddenly I'm like, was I wrong? Oh my God, was I wrong? Did I really make this mistake? Did I really get false information out there? And then I'm like, no, I didn't. But those are the things that have happened that have really irked me. But other than that, it hasn't been as much as you might think. So the final question I'd say is, I'm sure there are a lot of people listening to this who have their own area of interest and who are, maybe they've even started on TikTok or started blogging. Or they'd love to write a book, or is it is it, as you say, just kind of a just do whatever? You seem to have thrown the kitchen sink at everything. Is it that kind of feel, or is there any particular advice you can give people? Besides just do everything that you can all the time. I mean,
So the big thing is, first I say, really think about A, what you're interested in, and B, what your goal is. Do you want to write that book? Do you want to maybe get on TV? Do you want to be a TikTok star or like some sort of educational influencer? Like, what is it that you really want to do? And then kind of start focusing yourself in that direction. But also get as knowledgeable as you can about your subject, but also subjects relating to your subject. So yes, my expertise is piracy during the Golden Age, but I read loads of stuff about everything surrounding it: legal history, social history, women's history, religious history. There were lots of religious people who really went after pirates. Pirates in the 19th century up to today, pirates in the ancient world, medieval pirates. Get as knowledgeable as you can and do as much research and wide reading as you can. And there's loads of free websites with primary sources for you to be able to do to be able to do research through just some Google searches. You can find some. And then really kind of start promoting yourself. The big thing, no matter what you do, you got to get yourself on social media. You have to. It's not an option these days. I know people who I say that and they're like, oh no. And I'm like, nope, it's the world. You got to make yourself a website. Yeah. And you can do that for free on WordPress. It's very easy. That's what I did. And then really kind of start thinking about what your niche is. Start doing stuff to get stuff out there. Start blogging and post those links on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Write, maybe if you're on social media, do lots of posts about things. Even if you're writing a book that you don't want, and you don't want to do stuff like in other forms of media, you just want to write a book, you still have to get your name out there. Like, I have to work hard and hustle to get my work out there. And let me tell you, sometimes it feels like its own job just getting my stuff on social media when I've got so much other work to do. But it's just kind of the reality of the thing. But the big thing is, think of what you're interested in and don't think about, oh, well, will people find this interesting? Like, yes, you want to think about who your audience is. But ultimately, if you're not interested in your subject, you'll never be able to convey it well. So think about who your audience is, and then think about what you like and how you can communicate it effectively to an audience. Start a podcast. You can do that for free. Start a TikTok and just do daily facts. Loads of people do that sort of stuff, and it gets a lot of attention. So I feel like my answer is kind of all over the place. But the big thing I often say is read as much as you can. Think about what your goals are. Get active on social media.
There you go. So if you do that, then one day you could be a vaunted guest here on the Ask Historians podcast. That's the pinnacle of achievement right there. Thank you so much. We've been talking with Dr. Rebecca Simon, who is a historian of the Golden Age of Piracy, also has a new book called Pirate Queens, The Lives of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. And Rebecca, thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast, and we will see you next episode.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.